Hello and welcome to my tutorial of Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. In this poem, Tennyson is describing what happened to the British light cavalry force in the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War, where, through a miscommunication of orders, hundreds of soldiers were killed or injured. This poem is really interesting to study at the beginning of a sequence of lessons on war poetry, or if you're studying the conflict section of the AQA Past and Present anthology, because it provides a really interesting contrast to some of the attitudes towards armed conflict expressed in poems written during or after World War I. For most of this tutorial, I'm going to be looking at just 2 stanzas at a time, although you will see as we go through this that there will be a bit of cross-referencing backwards and forwards. So let's just have a look at the first 2 stanzas. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Now you could probably hear how the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson establishes a very deliberate pace and rhythm in the first stanza with half a league, half a league, half a league onwards. And this repetition represents the charge that the horses made as they rode into battle. And this idea of pace that's injected into the beginning of the poem is furthered by line 5 here, where we've got a bit of direct speech. Who the intended speaker is kept deliberately vague. I mean, presumably the voice is from one of the officers in charge of the Light Brigade, perhaps even Lord Cardigan, who allegedly took place in the battle himself. But by keeping the specifics of that detail hidden, Tennyson is stopping short of an outright criticism of those in charge who sent the Light Brigade on this suicidal attack. And instead, he directs the blame in line 12 at someone who had blundered, which seems an incredible understatement considering the circumstances. And this is an important point to realise and remember when you're studying this poem, which is that rather than being interested in criticising authority, Tennyson chooses to highlight the heroism of the ordinary rank and file cavalryman who rode into battle knowing that someone had made a mistake and yet following orders regardless. This attitude towards the relationship between officers and soldiers is expressed in a phrase which has even found its way into modern parlance, and it's towards the second half of stanza 2. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. It's probably the most famous line in the poem and begins one of the most important themes, that by not challenging authority and blindly following orders, even in the face of certain death, the Light Brigade were behaving honourably. Stanzas 3 and 4 are mostly thematically concerned with the battle itself. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death. Into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wandered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled, from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. So, as I said, stanza 3 begins to describe the battle itself, and it makes it quite clear quite quickly the impossible situation that the soldiers were in, surrounded by cannons firing at them from all directions, cannon to the right of them and cannon to the left of them. But from a literature point of view, this stanza is an opportunity for some really good close language analysis. Firstly, through this section here, volleyed and thundered. And the word volleyed suggests the quick succession of cannon fire, so rapid that the sounds almost roll over each other, appearing almost simultaneous cannon fire. And then the word thundered, with its obvious connotations of a huge, deep and menacing noise. These images are then cleverly linked in the next phrase, stormed at with shot and shell. And this suggests that they were being fired on in such quantity that it was almost like rain. And the heroism of the soldiers is indicated here through the use of this adverb here, boldly. But this is then juxtaposed with two metaphors in the next part here. And these are worth spending a little bit of time looking at. The first of them, the jaws of death and the mouth of hell. Notice that both death and hell are given capital letters here, as if Tennyson is personifying them into huge, dangerous, violent creatures that are about to swallow and consume the soldiers. And there's an inevitability here in the choice of language which suggests the soldiers are riding into certain death. And yet his focus in this stanza is purely observation. He comments on how well the soldiers rode. This stanza is devoid of criticism, again, for the leaders who sent the men to their deaths. It's free from the fear and anger, confusion, panic, bitterness, suffering that surely would have been experienced by the soldiers living through this. Tennyson wants us to see this as a heroic charge against impossible odds, and we're encouraged to view them with awe and admiration. Further evidence for this is found in the following stanza, where we've got the word flashed being repeated twice at the beginning of consecutive lines to suggest the light gleaming and reflecting off of the drawn swords, which are now being used, of course, to attack the enemy. And it's quite a romantic image of warfare, with the cavalrymen on horseback whirling their swords above their heads as they ride into battle. And these images of light are contrasted with images in the middle and latter part of the stanza. In particular, the bit here, which I'm just highlighting, plunged in the battery smoke, which provides a clear indication of the sheer volume of ordnance being fired by the cannons, which is literally turning the air black with smoke. And the poem as a whole is full of action, and no more so than this stanza, stanza 4, where the hand-to-hand combat itself takes place. And our attention is drawn again to the impossible odds the Light Brigade are up against, with this internal rhyme here, charging an army. And because it's the vowels which create the rhyme here, we call this assonance. Despite the odds, the soldiers managed to break right through the line of Russian guns, and the verbs here, reeled, shattered, and sundered depict the violence that the Light Brigade inflicted upon their enemy. At this point, anybody reading the poem might be led to believe that the battle had been a magnificent, albeit unlikely, success, and one which might well leave all the world to wonder. However, the caesura here, which breaks the penultimate line, and the repetition of the word not, both work together to indicate a significant change of tone. Okay, let's have a look at the final part of the poem, stanzas 5 and 6. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. Okay, so stanza 5 mirrors stanza 3 in much of its content, and that's quite an interesting structural point to make if you're going to be writing about this poem in your exams. However, there are one or two quite important differences. For example, in line 3 here, the cannons are now behind them because the brigade have turned and they are now riding away following the attack. Boldly they rode, and well in the earlier part of the poem has been usurped by this alliterative line, while horse and hero fell. And the fact that the brigade had suffered significant losses is suggested by the lines at the end of the stanza, all that was left of them. And in fact, of the 600 or so soldiers that made up the Light Brigade, there were 278 that were either killed or wounded, along with more than 300 horses. The final stanza of the poem begins with a rhetorical question: when can their glory fade? To which we are encouraged to respond, well, never. And this final part of the poem is full of vocabulary that has this same sort of message. We've got the word glory, honour, honour's repeated twice, and noble at the end of the poem. The fact that honour is repeated twice, honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, is significant because these are imperatives, these are commands that we're being told to do this by Tennyson. Now, I started this tutorial by stating how interesting this poem is to read as a contrast to some of the other poems that you may well read which are on the theme of war. And as you go on to study other poems, or as you read other poems of your own interest, it would be interesting for you to question whether you find this message is still relevant today. Is it still reflected in the poems that were written during and after World War I, or has the theme, tone and content of those poems, the message and the ideas that have got across, have they changed? My guess is that you will find a much greater sense of anger and bitterness and loss in the poems that you will go on to read as people began to realise the true horrors of armed conflict.